Hiya. This is a question for Amy about the pellets. And my question is, do you have to make them brand new every time you use them, or can you store them? And if so, what conditions would you recommend to store them and don't have any contamination?
Hello, yes. I do make them ahead of time and store them. You can store them in like a larger quantity of deionized water in the refrigerator, because if you punch them out and store them in a Ziploc baggie, they'll eventually lose their moisture and just kind of shrivel up or grow mold. So refrigerator in deionized water, but then you have the problem of having to fish them out with your tweezers because they kind of, I guess, have the same refractive index as water, so they disappear.
Is this working? Yes, okay. So I actually have a follow-up question for Amy. So you showed the box at the end saying within this range they seem to work pretty well, but of course you wouldn't really know that you were outside of that range unless you could do a cold extraction, which most of the time you can't. So I was wondering, are there any kind of tall tale signs where when you look at your paper and then you get the result and you might think, actually, I don't really trust it, it might be outside of the box? How do you deal with this?
I think that's a really great question. I think most experienced paper conservators, and I'm still developing this experience, can a lot of times look at or feel a piece of paper and know that it's going to be very acidic because it's brittle or very brown, or manufactured in a certain period of time when they were using wood pulp fibers and things like that. So those might be clues that your pH may be below 4.5, and then clues that your pH would be alkaline, neutral to alkaline would be papers that were probably manufactured after the introduction of like calcium buffers and things like that.
Oh, we've got a question in the front. We've got one in the back first. Okay, first back.
More of a correction for what Amy said is that all these things were introduced by Richard. I just followed along. So as usual, it's Richard.
Thank you, Chris. I wanted to give you some credit.
I have a question for Amy too, sorry. And the question is, how have you reached this optimal thickness for the plugs? Is that, but I was wondering if they're thinner, if they're more sensitive to different pHs or not?
I tried different thicknesses. Actually, I reached the conclusion of 3 millimeters because they're easier to handle, actually. So when you're handling these tiny little pellets with tweezers, they're kind of tricky to get them into the meters, and especially when you're using the pellet. I didn't go into this in my paper, but when you're using the pellets to measure conductivity, the conductivity meter has a slightly different shaped reservoir, so they're 4 millimeters in diameter and 3 millimeters thickness, to me, was the optimal size for handling. And it really made no difference on the measurements, right around in that range.
Sorry, maybe I haven't understood you precisely. This is a question for Amy too. How exactly is the measurement of the pH value? Because the pH is a potential measurement, so it makes very a lot difference between 5.3 and 5.6. So
that, I think, is a good point. But when you're getting into a difference between 4.5 and 6.5, would you think that there's a difference there? Yeah.
yes, I think it makes a difference. For treating and after treatment control, I mean. Thank you.
I have a question about the NMR used to determine the bound, quote unquote, in free water in the agar gels.
Yes.
Do you have an estimate of what proportion of water acts bound and what acts free?
Yes, we have estimated that the bound water is around 4 and 7% for the total, according to the concentration, of course. And for the free water, we have around 93-97%.
Can I ask a follow-up on this? Because that was one of my questions, actually. So in your presentation, you showed graphs where you looked at the change in T2 of the bound and free water, and I didn't have enough time to process. So as you change the agar concentration and you make those pores smaller, does the bound water to free water ratio remain the same, or does one of them, do you get more bound water, or?
With the concentration?
Of agar.
Yes, the ratio is quite the same. But we have detected that we can say, and this trend is continue till 10% of concentration.
Okay. A question for More too. Did you consider a problem related to the use of water-based gel in a bronze patina in which, for instance, hydroxychloride may be present?
Probably I'm not so clear during my presentation, but I apply the agar gels on stone, not on...
Okay. Sorry.
Hi, there's a question for Amy. I found your talk very interesting, and I wish I had this information just some weeks before because I had to do some pH measurement, and I tried with agarose too, and I found the inconvenience that I had to take lots and lots of measurements, and the agarose dried. And I was wondering whether you found with this inconvenience too. And, well, at the end, since the Toriba pH meter appeared to be just one, the surface pH meter seemed to be more precise. I decided to use that because I could do that, because the samples, I could just throw them after that. It was not an old paper or anything that I mean, I could stain that. And I was wondering whether you decided to compare with that pH meter too.
I did. In my paper, I compared cold extraction with surface measurement using an electrode. I just didn't include that in my talk with the agarose gel measurements. And I found if you have disposable materials, if you're doing a study, I would recommend cold extraction first, surface measurement next, and then the agarose gel method. But I think the benefit of the agarose gel method is that you're so much less likely to damage your work of art. And then as far as your first question goes, in a space of 5 minutes, I don't find that the pellet loses very much moisture in that short amount of time. And then when you take it and you put it into the well, you're kind of rehydrating it with that drop of water anyway. So I didn't find that it was a problem. Does that answer? Yeah.
50 or 60. I had to measure lots of them. Yeah. So yeah, it was more than 5 minutes, no? And it just dried. And I was wondering whether that lessened the accuracy of the pH at the end. So since I wasn't sure about that, I just changed to the surface pH meter?
Well, I did find in my experiments that even leaving a pellet on the surface of a paper for 20 minutes made no significant difference in the
Okay.
measurement. But if you're I think I'm in favor of the agarose gel method when you're dealing with individual art objects. When you're doing a bigger study with lots of data, then sticking with the TAPI measurements probably a good idea.
Thank you.
I have a question for Moira too. And I'd like to ask that I'm a stone conservator in the Hungarian Museum of Fine Arts, and I was wondering what kind of pH did you use the agar complexes on the marble pieces? Because I've seen 1% EDTA, but which pH?
The pH is quite acid in the case of ADTA. We have also tried to alkalify the pH in case of ADTA with ammonium carbonate, but the results was not suitable. And in this case, we have preferred to taste the triammonium citrate in this case, and we have good results in this case.
Please come again, I didn't understand completely. So which pH was, because I didn't catch it.
In the case of ADTA, is around acid.
Yeah, I know, but sometimes we just adjust it to about a 9
Yes.
pH or so, and I was wondering about that.
No, we have just tasted agar with a DTA, also if in the case of model sample without adjusting the pH.
And do you think it has any kind of negative effect on the stone because it's
Yes,
calcareous
it's
stone?
for this reason that we have moved our research with other additives.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Hi, thank you very much for fantastic talks. Question for Amy. To what extent do you think the pH readings are affected by the pH of the deionized water?
That's a complicated question. I think because I'm kind of following along with the TAPI standards, that I'm sure they are affected by the pH of the deionized water and the absorption of CO2 and all of that. But I guess I think of pH as, I don't believe in a true pH of paper, and that these are just operational measurements so that we can compare across different samples.
I wanted to, I guess, maybe actually ask a question of Emma. And I thought it was very interesting to relate back to our previous session, yes, where we had a conversation about carrying out this long experimental step before a treatment and whether or not this is going to be something that has to be done all the time. And I thought your study was very interesting for that. And I guess it's more of a comment in that we've heard quite a lot of people talk about using various combinations of blotters and weights, and I was actually wondering whether you think on your textile piece, whether you tested that kind of balancing between an upward pull with a blotter and a weight, or whether you think that might help if you haven't.
Thank you. You know, it's funny when you do these long progressive things that take years. And I wanted to try and stay with the research in Glasgow to keep it as consistent as possible. And it was brought up to me later on. And my biggest fear in terms of removing the gel and then replacing it, and why I didn't dry in between that, was that wonderful wet-dry interface that you always wind up with textiles when you have the tie lining and everything collects at a point and then it dries and then you have a weakening and a long-term issue. And so I didn't in this case, and it was very much trying to figure out how you can control within the textile media. I didn't want to add anything. I didn't want to put in the barrier layers that you often see in these treatments, because if I can't control it at a baseline level, how am I going to navigate this in the future?
Hi. Yes. One more question about operational pH for Amy. Okay, so would it make, because if I understand correctly, you are taking a range of pH of papers as a sort of calibration to make your readings of the pH. But I would assume that the nature of the acidity of that paper comes from different compounds, because you don't exactly know the origin of those acidic components. So would it make sense to use or soak a sort of standardized material in an acid solution, that you increase the acidity and then sort of calibrate your pH meter against that?
Could you describe this a little bit more?
Well, just generally to make sure that you are always measuring the same acid, because it might have an interaction with your agars in such a way that's not basically released into the drop, and therefore affect your readings.
I'm not sure if I'm completely understanding your proposal, but one step further that I wanted to take this was having the agarose pellets that I've used to measure the pH analyzed to see what kind of acids they are extracting and what they're not, and how that differs from just a water extraction. I don't know.
We can discuss it again. Thank you.
I have a question for Moira. I enjoyed your presentation, but you were very polite and you said that the conservation products were probably purified in a different way. I would think they are adulterated by adding some cellulose material, which is much less expensive than agar. What do you say about that?
My research want to understand if the presence of this part could be spread inside the porosity, could influence the performance, it could join with the complexation during the cleaning.
Find it rather disturbing that there is some cellulose in there, because you know the adhesiveness can be completely different then. You think you are using agar, instead there is some cellulose in there. Well.
It's a good question.
Yeah. Thanks for your work.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up in that, actually. So I think one of the reasons why I was so interested by Moira's work is precisely because it touches on this question of whether the network that forms the gel contributes to the cleaning. And I think we've seen earlier with Paolo's talk as well, this propensity of these networks to possibly chelate some metal ions. And you found that it was better with a chelator. But I was wondering, in your studies of the different types of agar, whether the differences between them, if you've looked at whether they are able to chelate differently. And this would actually very much address this really interesting question to me.
Till now, we have just tasted the chelation capacity of one product, such as agar